Eastern Front, World War II. From June 22, 1941 to May 9, 1945, the Eastern Front of World War II stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, becoming the largest and bloodiest battlefield in history. It began when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion ever, against the Soviet Union. Hitler sought to destroy communism and seize land for his empire, while Stalin's Red Army fought desperately to defend their homeland. This was more than a clash of armies. It was a war of annihilation, marked by massacres, starvation, and scorched earth tactics. Battles like Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Siege of Leningrad defined the brutality. In Stalingrad, entire blocks were reduced to rubble in street-by-street combat. Kursk saw the largest tank battle in history, with steel clashing across the plains. Leningrad endured nearly 900 days of starvation and bombardment, where bread was rationed to crumbs and freezing temperatures claimed as many lives as bullets. Soldiers faced -40-degree winters, relentless artillery, and the constant threat of disease. The human cost was staggering. Around 4.8 million Axis troops and 8.7 million Soviet soldiers were killed or went missing. During major offensives, a soldier's life expectancy on the front line could be measured in weeks. By the time the Red Army took Berlin in May 1945, the Soviet victory had come at a cost so great that survival itself became the ultimate measure of success. On the Eastern Front, there were no easy battles, only the brutal choice between death and enduring the war's end. The Iran-Iraq War, fought from September 22, 1980 to August 20, 1988, was one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. It began when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein launched a full-scale invasion of Iran, aiming to seize the oil-rich Khuzestan province and control the Shatt al-Arab waterway. The attack came less than 2 years after Iran's Islamic Revolution, at a time when its military was weakened and divided. What followed was nearly 8 years of grinding warfare along the western Iranian and eastern Iraqi frontiers. The conflict was defined by trench warfare, massive artillery duels, human wave assaults, and the extensive use of chemical weapons, most notoriously by Iraqi forces. Casualty estimates vary, but historians agree that between 500,000 and over 1 million people were killed, with Iran suffering the heaviest losses. Iranian records suggest roughly 188,000 to 217,000 military deaths, about 70 soldiers killed every single day for 8 years. Many were young conscripts in their late teens or early 20s, sent into battles where survival was often measured in days. Major offensives like Operation Karbala 5 or the Battle of the Fao Peninsula claimed tens of thousands of lives in weeks. When the UN-brokered ceasefire finally took hold in August 1988, neither side had gained any significant territory. The borders remained unchanged, but both nations were devastated, economically drained, socially fractured, and with a generation of soldiers either dead, maimed, or forever scarred by a war that left no victors. World War I, fought from July 28, 1914, to November 11, 1918, became known as the Great War. It began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, setting off a chain reaction of alliances that pulled the world's major powers into a conflict stretching across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and beyond. The Allies and the Central Powers clashed in what became one of the deadliest wars in human history. On the Western Front, the war devolved into trench warfare, hundreds of miles of mud, barbed wire, and fortified lines where soldiers lived in constant fear of artillery shells, poison gas, and sniper fire. The conditions were brutal. Waterlogged trenches bred disease, frostbite claimed limbs, and medical treatment was primitive, with no antibiotics to stop deadly infections. In battles like the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele, tens of thousands fell in a single day, often for gains measured in yards. The human cost was staggering. Around 65 million men were mobilized, with an estimated 9 to 11 million soldiers killed and over 20 million wounded. Artillery accounted for most combat deaths, while disease and exposure claimed countless more. For infantrymen on the front lines, casualty rates in some offensives reached 50%, and survival often came down to luck. By the armistice in November 1918, Empires had crumbled, borders had shifted, and an entire generation was marked by the relentless, grinding horror of a war few who fought in it would ever forget. By the way, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'll greatly appreciate it if you could show support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much. The 30 Years' War, fought from 1618 to 1648, consumed Central Europe in one of the most destructive conflicts in history. It began as a religious struggle between Protestant and Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire, but it quickly drew in major powers like Sweden, France, and Spain, transforming into a brutal contest for political dominance. The war raged across what is now Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, and beyond, leaving no corner untouched. For soldiers, the front lines were a place of relentless hardship. Campaigns dragged on for years with no guarantee of pay, forcing men to loot to survive. Armies marched through disease-ridden terrain, fought in sieges that could last months, and endured winters with little shelter. Muskets, pikes, and cannon fire tore through tightly packed ranks, and wounds often meant death from infection. But the greatest killers weren't on the battlefield. Plague, typhus, and starvation claimed far more lives than bullets or blades. The scale of death was staggering. Out of an estimated 4.5 to 8 million total deaths, soldiers made up over 1 million, with some regiments losing over 80% of their men. In Sweden's Bygdeå parish, of 230 men sent to fight, 215 were killed or vanished, and only 5 returned, crippled for life. By the war's end, large parts of Central Europe had lost more than half their population. Entire towns vanished, and farmland lay in ruins. For those who fought, the 30 Years' War was not just a struggle of faith and politics. It was a drawn-out march through famine, disease, and slaughter, where the odds of survival were almost non-existent. The Napoleonic Wars. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led the Grande Armée, over 600,000 men, across the Niemen River, launching an invasion of Russia that would become one of the deadliest campaigns in military history. His goal was to force Tsar Alexander I back into the continental system, an economic blockade against Britain. But the Russians refused to meet him in a decisive battle. Instead, they retreated deeper into their own territory, destroying villages, crops, and supplies in a scorched earth strategy that left nothing for the French to eat or use. The heat of summer gave way to autumn rains that turned roads into quagmires, slowing the army's progress and crippling its supply lines. On September 7th at Borodino, the two armies clashed in the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 250,000 men fought, and around 68,000 were killed or wounded, yet neither side claimed a clear victory. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14th, only to find the city abandoned and burning. With no food, no shelter, and no surrender from the Tsar, he faced a grim choice: stay and starve or retreat. By October, the retreat began. Then came the Russian winter. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite, starvation, and disease claimed far more lives than combat. Cossack cavalry harassed the retreating columns, picking off the stragglers. By the time the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée crossed back over the Niemen River in December, barely 100,000 men remained. Less than 1 in 6 soldiers had survived, and Napoleon's Russian campaign had become not just a failed invasion, but a march into annihilation. The Peloponnesian War, fought from April 431 BCE to April 404 BCE, consumed the Greek world in a struggle for supremacy between Athens and its Delian League allies, and Sparta with its Peloponnesian League. At its heart was a clash of empires: Athens, a naval power with democratic ideals, and Sparta, a land-based military state, driven by fear, rivalry, and Athens' growing dominance over trade and politics in the region. For the soldiers, this was not a short campaign, but a grueling 27-year ordeal. On land, hoplite warriors fought in dense phalanx formations, their bronze armor and heavy shields pressing shoulder to shoulder as they shoved against enemy lines. One stumble, one break in formation, and the line could collapse, leaving men exposed to a brutal end. At sea, Athenian triremes carried crews of nearly 200 in cramped, suffocating conditions, where rowers labored under blistering sun or driving rain with blistered hands and little rest, always one sudden ram or storm away from death. Disease proved deadlier than the spear. The plague of Athens, striking between 430 and 426 BCE, killed an estimated 75,000 to 100,000 people, about a quarter of the city's population, wiping out soldiers and civilians alike, and even forcing Sparta to abandon a siege in horror. Morale shattered with disasters like the Sicilian expedition, where thousands of Athenians were killed or enslaved, and the siege of Melos, where all adult men were executed and women and children sold into slavery. After decades of sieges, naval blockades, and battles, the toll was staggering. While exact numbers are lost to history, battlefield losses could reach 15% in a single engagement, and countless more died from disease, shipwreck, or captivity. Survival often came down to luck as much as skill. When Athens finally surrendered in 404 BCE, its empire was dismantled, its walls torn down, and its fleet reduced to a token force. For those who fought, the Peloponnesian War was a generation-long descent into exhaustion, loss, and devastation, one of the harshest tests a soldier of the ancient world could endure. The Vietnam War, lasting from November 1st, 1955, to April 30th, 1975, engulfed Southeast Asia in a brutal and protracted conflict. Most of the fighting took place in South Vietnam, but the war spilled into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It began as a struggle over ideology. North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, sought to unite the nation under communism, while South Vietnam, supported by the United States and its allies, fought to prevent its spread. For soldiers on the ground, this was a war with no clear front lines. The dense jungles became a living nightmare, concealing an enemy skilled in guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong used ambushes, hidden booby traps, and vast tunnel networks to strike suddenly and vanish. Troops faced relentless heat, suffocating humidity, monsoon rains, and diseases like malaria, while the psychological toll grew heavier with each day. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 marked a turning point, with massive, coordinated attacks across South Vietnam that shocked U.S. forces and eroded public support for the war back home. By the war's end, more than 58,000 Americans were dead and around 300,000 wounded. South Vietnam's military lost up to 250,000 soldiers, while North Vietnam and the Viet Cong suffered over 1 million combat deaths. Civilian casualties across Vietnam were estimated at nearly 2 million. For U.S. forces, the fatality rate was about 2.6%, but with injuries included, 1 in 10 who served became a casualty. When Saigon fell on April 30, 1975, the war closed in defeat for South Vietnam, leaving behind a legacy of deep physical and emotional scars for those who survived. And for many, survival itself came at an unbearable cost. The Crimean War, fought from October 1853 to February 1856, raged across the Crimean Peninsula and the Black Sea region, drawing Russia into a brutal conflict against an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and later Sardinia-Piedmont. What began as a dispute over Christian minority rights in the Holy Land spiraled into a wider struggle for power, as Britain and France sought to curb Russian expansion into Ottoman territory. For soldiers, this war was a battle against two enemies, human and unseen. The siege of Sevastopol, the bloodshed at Inkerman, and the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava defined the fighting, but it was disease that claimed the most lives. Cholera, typhus, and dysentery tore through camps where sanitation was poor and supplies scarce. Medical knowledge was outdated, wounds became death sentences, and winter in the Crimea brought starvation, frostbite, and despair. Of the estimated 500,000 deaths, only a fraction came from direct combat. In the British Army alone, roughly 2,755 men were killed in action, while more than 16,000 died from disease. For many regiments, the odds of surviving were less than even. By the war's end, the Treaty of Paris left borders much as they were before, but for the soldiers who endured it, the Crimean War was a test of endurance where survival depended more on luck than on skill or courage. The Mongol invasions. From 1206 to the late 14th century, the Mongol invasions swept across Asia, the Middle East, and deep into Europe under Genghis Khan and his successors. What began as a campaign for expansion, trade control, and revenge against rival powers evolved into one of the most destructive military conquests in history. The Mongol army combined unmatched cavalry speed, deadly horse archers, advanced siege engineering, and psychological terror, often slaughtering entire populations to break resistance before it began. The death toll is estimated between 30 and 40 million, with some cities, like Merv in 1221, losing nearly every inhabitant, hundreds of thousands in a single event. Defenders faced starvation during long sieges, relentless arrow volleys, and sudden cavalry charges that left little chance of retreat. Those captured could be executed on the spot or forced into the Mongol ranks, where survival meant fighting, and often dying in the next assault. For soldiers, the odds were grim. Entire garrisons were wiped out, and surrender rarely guaranteed mercy. By the time the invasion slowed, vast territories lay in ruins, cultures were erased, and for those who had stood against the Mongol horde, survival was a rare exception to an almost certain death. The Russo-Ukrainian War, in its full-scale phase since February 24, 2022, has transformed the heart of Eastern Europe into one of the deadliest battlefields of the 21st century. Russia's invasion swept across Ukraine's borders with tanks, artillery, and airstrikes, aiming to topple Kiev in days. That plan collapsed, and instead the conflict settled into a brutal war of attrition, one that grinds soldiers down day after day. From the devastating siege of Mariupol in 2022, where defenders fought for nearly 3 months without relief, to the year-long struggle for Bakhmut in 2022 to 2023, the fighting has been relentless. Soldiers on both sides endure trench warfare under constant artillery bombardment, freezing winters and sweltering summers, with supply lines strained and evacuation often impossible. Every advance is paid for in blood, every retreat leaves nothing but rubble behind. By mid-2025, Russian military deaths are estimated at around 250,000, with total casualties, including wounded, approaching 1 million. Ukraine's armed forces have suffered between 60,000 and 100,000 killed, with several 100,000 more wounded. In some of the fiercest sectors, like Bakhmut, certain units lost more than 80% of their personnel, and frontline survival could be measured in just days. The outcome remains uncertain, but for the soldiers still in the trenches, survival is a daily gamble. This is not a war of swift victories. It is a war where endurance itself is the rarest resource. The Russian Civil War, fought from November 7, 1917, to October 25, 1922, consumed the vast lands of the former Russian Empire. Born out of the chaos of the October Revolution, it pitted the Bolshevik Red Army against the anti-Bolshevik White Forces, while nationalist militias, anarchists, and foreign armies joined the fray. At its heart, the war was a battle for control of a nation collapsing under the weight of revolution, famine, and political fracture. For the soldiers caught in it, the war offered no mercy. Front lines shifted constantly, stretching from the frozen forests of Siberia to the ruined cities of European Russia. Men fought in temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius, often without proper boots or winter gear. Ammunition was scarce, and rifles were outdated relics of the First World War. Disease, especially typhus, swept through the ranks, killing indiscriminately. Hunger hollowed out entire regiments, and prisoners often faced execution rather than captivity. By the war's end, an estimated 7 to 12 million people were dead, most from starvation and disease. Military losses numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with about 300,000 killed in combat and nearly 500,000 more claimed by illness. In some units, surviving the winter was less likely than surviving the battlefield. The Red Army emerged victorious, but the victory came at the cost of a shattered country and generations scarred by one of the harshest wars a soldier could endure. The 100 Years' War, fought between England and France from 1337 to 1453, was a century-long struggle for the French crown and control over territory like Aquitaine. It began when England's Edward III claimed the right to rule France, challenging King Philip VI and igniting a conflict that spanned 3 generations. The war unfolded in brutal phases, the Edwardian, Caroline, and Lancastrian campaigns, marked by shifting truces, renewed invasions, and devastation across Western Europe. For soldiers, survival was far from guaranteed. Battles like Crécy in 1346 saw the English longbow cut down thousands of French men-at-arms in a single day, with French losses possibly reaching 10,000 to 30,000. At Agincourt in 1415, outnumbered English forces inflicted over 6,000 French deaths, while disease like dysentery, contracted during the siege of Harfleur just weeks earlier, had already thinned their ranks. Long sieges such as Rouen in 1418 trapped civilians and soldiers alike, leading to starvation so severe that around 12,000 civilians perished before the city fell. Casualties throughout the war are impossible to calculate exactly, but armies could lose half their strength to disease and hunger before ever seeing battle. Even victories often came at the cost of entire companies being wiped out, and the final years saw the English army shattered at battles like Formigny and Castillon. By 1453, France had reclaimed nearly all lost territory, but for the countless soldiers who marched under their banners, the 100 Years' War offered little chance of returning home alive. The Soviet-Afghan War, fought from December 25, 1979 to February 15, 1989, was a grinding Cold War conflict that turned Afghanistan into one of the deadliest assignments a soldier could face. The Soviet Union invaded to prop up a struggling communist government against the Mujahideen, guerrilla fighters backed by the United States, Pakistan, China, and other allies. What Moscow expected to be a quick operation became a decade-long war of attrition in some of the harshest terrain on Earth. For Soviet troops, daily life was a battle for survival. The jagged mountains favored insurgents who knew every pass and canyon, striking convoys with rocket-propelled grenades, landmines, and ambushes before disappearing into the landscape. Helicopter crews were prime targets, as were supply trucks moving through narrow valleys. The blistering summers and freezing winters took a toll, while diseases like hepatitis, typhoid, and dysentery claimed almost as many soldiers as combat. Food shortages, poor sanitation, and the constant uncertainty of who among the locals might be an enemy eroded morale. By war's end, official Soviet records listed over 14,000 soldiers killed, more than 53,000 wounded, and hundreds of thousands sick or injured. Some historians place the death toll closer to 26,000. Afghan losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of civilians dead, entire villages destroyed, and a country left in ruins. In certain Soviet units, the odds of being killed or wounded were staggeringly high, sometimes exceeding 50%. When the last Soviet troops withdrew in 1989, they left behind a war they could not win, and a generation of soldiers scarred for life, both physically and mentally. The American Civil War. From April 12, 1861 to April 9, 1865, the American Civil War consumed the United States in a conflict that pitted North against South, Union against Confederacy. Born from decades of tension over states' rights, the expansion of slavery, and the future of the nation, the war raged across thousands of miles, from the hills of Virginia to the Mississippi River, leaving entire towns in ruins and families forever divided. For the soldiers, this was not just a battle against the enemy. It was a battle for survival in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Camps were overcrowded, sanitation was almost non-existent, and clean water was scarce. Disease became a far greater killer than gunfire. Dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia swept through regiments, claiming twice as many lives as combat itself. A musket wound could mean amputation without anesthesia, with infection often sealing a man's fate. The battles were relentless. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, names forever etched in blood. The smoke of musket volleys hung thick over the fields. Artillery shells tore men apart, and bayonet charges turned open ground into killing zones. Prison camps like Andersonville became nightmares of starvation, overcrowding, and disease, where thousands perished behind wooden stockades. By the war's end, an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers lay dead, about 1 in 4 who served. For those who survived, the physical scars were matched only by the weight of what they had endured. The Union was preserved, slavery abolished, but the cost was a generation of lives, making the American Civil War the deadliest conflict in the nation's history, and one of the worst wars to be a soldier in. The Franco-Prussian War, fought from July 19, 1870 to May 10, 1871, was a brutal clash between the Second French Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia with its German allies. Centered in northeastern France and along the Rhine, the conflict erupted after years of mounting tension over German unification, inflamed by the diplomatic crisis surrounding the Ems dispatch. What began as a test of national pride quickly spiraled into a nightmare for the soldiers on both sides. French troops marched to the front confident in their modern chassepot rifles, while the Germans relied on efficient organization and their Dries needle guns. But the industrial age had transformed the battlefield. At Sedan on September 1, 1870, French forces were annihilated, with more than 100,000 men captured alongside Emperor Napoleon III. The war then shifted to sieges, none more desperate than Paris, encircled from September 19, 1870 to January 28, 1871. Soldiers and civilians alike endured freezing temperatures, starvation, and disease, eating rats, horses, and even zoo animals to survive. By the war's end, France had suffered about 138,000 military dead and over 474,000 captured or interned. German forces lost roughly 44,700 dead, with disease killing more than the enemy's bullets. For a French soldier, the odds of avoiding death, wounds, or captivity were slim, and survival often meant returning home broken in body and spirit. Prussia's victory toppled Napoleon III, united Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm I, and left France humiliated. A short war by the calendar, but one of unrelenting hardship for those who fought it. The Korean War, fought from June 25, 1950 to July 27, 1953, engulfed the Korean peninsula in a brutal clash between North and South. It began when North Korean forces, armed and backed by the Soviet Union, stormed across the 38th parallel, seeking to unify the peninsula under communist control. South Korea, on the brink of collapse, was rescued by a United Nations coalition led by the United States. In late 1950, China entered the war on the North's side, turning the conflict into a bloody stalemate. For soldiers, this was a war of extremes. Summers brought sweltering heat and relentless monsoon rains that turned battlefields into mud traps. Winters were a different kind of torture. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, seizing rifles, immobilizing tanks, and inflicting frostbite on thousands. The fighting was unforgiving, marked by trench warfare, sudden ambushes, and savage hilltop battles like the Chosin Reservoir, where U.S. Marines battled not only encirclement by Chinese forces, but temperatures so cold they froze rations solid. The human cost was staggering. Over 1 million soldiers from all sides were killed, alongside 2 to 3 million civilians. The United States alone lost more than 36,000 service members, with over 103,000 wounded. Many units suffered casualty rates above 30%, and survival often meant a lifetime of physical and psychological scars. When the armistice was signed in July 1953, the front lines lay almost exactly where they had started. Korea remained divided, and for those who fought, the war was far from forgotten. It was a relentless ordeal, a fight against both a determined enemy and a land that punished survival at every step. The Spanish Civil War raged from July 17, 1936 to April 1, 1939, tearing Spain apart in one of the bloodiest internal conflicts of the 20th century. It pitted the Republican government, an uneasy alliance of leftists, liberals, and anarchists, against the nationalists, a coalition of conservatives, monarchists, and fascists led by General Francisco Franco. Backed by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, Franco's forces clashed with Republican troops supported by the Soviet Union and thousands of foreign volunteers from the international brigades. For the soldiers, this was a war of extremes. Battle lines shifted constantly, with combat ranging from the scorched plains of Andalusia to the snowbound mountains of Teruel. Soldiers endured relentless artillery bombardments, machine gun fire, and aerial bombings that targeted not just the front but also civilian cities. Supply shortages left men starving, poorly clothed, and fighting with outdated or improvised weapons. Disease swept through the ranks, and medical care was primitive. The cold at Teruel in the winter of 1937 to 38 froze rifles in men's hands, while summer heat elsewhere brought dehydration and exhaustion. The toll was catastrophic. Around 500,000 people died, with combat accounting for roughly 200,000 of those losses. About 110,000 on the Republican side and 90,000 among the nationalists. Thousands more were executed after capture, and the international brigades suffered especially heavy losses, with some units losing nearly a third of their men in a single engagement. For a frontline soldier, the odds of surviving unscathed were less than even. When the nationalists claimed victory in April 1939, Spain entered a dictatorship that would last until 1975, but for those who fought, the war never truly ended. It lived on in the scars, the memories, and the haunting silence left in its wake. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.